Welcome to PR Talk, sponsored by the PRSA of Oregon. This is your host, Amy Rosenberg, founder of Veracity and author of A Modern Guide to Public Relations. Help other people find our podcast by subscribing, rating, giving us a review, or sharing on social media. Thanks for tuning in. Hi, everyone. I have Michael Cottam here. He is the founder and operator of Visual Itineraries. And beyond that, he's just very well known in the search community as somebody who really knows what they're doing. Like, he's very respected. Hi, Michael.
Hi, Amy. How are you?
Good. Thank you for joining us. So before we get into how PR and search can work together and possibly why they should, can you first tell us about your company and your background and all the goods?
Sure. So Visual Itineraries is a travel planning tool for consumers. And I built that after I sold another travel company called The Big Day that I started back in 2001. And to get traffic for The Big Day, which was a honeymoon travel site, I kind of had to go to school on SEO to get traffic from organic search. The travel space is really competitive with big players like Expedia, Priceline, Travelocity out there spending millions of dollars a month on paid search. And we didn't have that sort of budget. So we had to go the organic search route. So I learned how to do SEO and get traffic from organic search. After I sold that company, then I went into SEO consulting from there, and kind of as a side job, I'm still very interested in the travel space online. So I built Visual Itineraries from there, and that brings in a bunch of traffic for people looking to go to Tahiti and Fiji and Seychelles and places like that. So that Visual Itinerary site is a nice side business for me, but it's also a sandbox where I can test out SEO things without inflicting them on my clients if they go wrong.
Oh, that's kind of cool. And so originally you were a software engineer, even for, it looks like IBM.
Yep.
Yeah. And so you kind of touched on how you got into SEO, but you, as a software engineer, you launched your company and then learned about SEO and then also continued with SEO as a career path.
That's right.
Okay. That's fascinating. So SEO is technical, and that's why being a software engineer can help. But then there are some things, from the PR side that we can do to boost organic SEO, especially. And
Absolutely.
So can you talk about why PR and search are so important to each other? And then possibly we'll move into what PR can do to help boost search and kind of new things that we're seeing in Google to increase our clients' websites in the search results.
Sure. So the first thing to recognize is from day one, Google wanted a way to rank web pages in the search results based on what's popular, what's hot, what's going on. And as everybody knows, their model for that was a thing called PageRank. They're basically counting links to your site like it's votes. And that's how this all started. People who were purely technical SEO kinds of folks started off thinking, well, Google, if which one is links, I can make you links. And so the game went back and forth between SEOs and Google, SEOs building links that weren't really editorial votes that indicate any popularity, but it worked with the Google algorithm. The long game is what Google always has wanted to be able to measure is whether something really is popular, really is a good resource, really is referred to all the time in whatever industry space that is. And so if you're spending your time and effort playing games with manipulating the link graph and things like that, you're missing the point. Eventually, Google's going to catch up. So how does that get us to PR? What PR does is PR helps get the word out about your business, about what you're doing, show people that you have some expertise in something. So it's not just like, hey, I've got this product, everybody should learn about it and buy it and see it and whatever, but getting the experts at your company in whatever your space is mentioned in the press as an expert in that space with opinions and sound bites and that sort of stuff, so that the consumers out there keep seeing that company's name and those people's names and goes, wow, these guys must really be the experts in this space. Google wants to see that and use that notability that they're getting because you keep getting quoted in newspapers and magazines and speaking at conferences and all this kind of real world stuff that really does indicate that you're the hot commodity in whatever that space is. And PR helps you get that. Google wants to measure things like links and measure the knowledge and entity graph of who people are and what they're connected to and how and what space are they in and what's their authority level and what sites have they written for on this topic and things like that. And that's Google mechanically is trying to replicate what a human being would do to figure out whether somebody really knows their stuff in that space and has the best whatever it is. If you have the best blue widget in the world, then one would expect to see lots of articles that are reviewing blue widgets, putting you out there as number one.
So then it's the PR's job possibly to get those articles.
Yep. And to get that brand awareness out there. And some PR is not necessary to get the consumers or the purchasers to see that, but some PR is to get other potential partners out there to learn about you and decide to partner with you and strengthen your offerings and your distribution network and your exposure and all that sort of stuff as well. So some of it can be kind of indirect that way.
Okay. So I'm a person that just gets right down to the matter. And I really like to know like what I'm supposed to do. Like I just operate that way. I think a lot of PR people do, but for me, it's like, just tell me what to do and I'll do it. And so all I needed to know was at one point, I was just really focused on links, just getting links. So getting stories is great, but I really just honed in on getting those links. And then I spoke with Rand and he on the podcast, I guess 2 weeks ago, he said that possibly links aren't as important anymore. And it might just be more about what you're talking about, which is just overall general coverage. Is that correct?
I think that's very true. I think Google started off leaning so heavily on links. It was so bad that you could have a restaurant with a website built in Flash that Google couldn't see a single word about what that was about. And with links, you could get that restaurant to rank number one for Italian restaurant in San Francisco or whatever competitive term it was. So originally it was all about links, and they leaned really heavily on that. Since then, Google has really improved their ability to recognize quality content, to recognize whether a page covers a topic really thoroughly. And most recently with this expertise, authority, and trust push that started back, I guess, in August of 2018 with the Medic update, to be able to dive into the structure of a page and figure out, well, who was it that wrote this page on widgets and what tells us that this person actually knows anything about widgets, and be able to follow little trails back across the web to realize that, okay, the person who wrote this page about widgets is Michael Cottam, and Michael Cottam also did this conference presentation about widgets over here and wrote this paper about it over here and got quoted in this news story about widgets over here and has a separate website where they build widgets. So, wow, he must really know about widgets. So Google's able to start to do that.
Yeah. And so then that sounds like it kind of ties into what you were going to talk about with EAT, which is expertise, authoritativeness, and trustworthiness, which is Google doing the sleuthing essentially to see, what street creds the website has, whether it's from the author or whatnot, just like what you're saying. And was there something else that you wanted to talk about, something with EAT, right?
Right. So Google wants to be able to trace back this along these lines and figure out what, first of all, in the piece of content itself that you're getting published, Google needs to be able to somehow figure out who are the people involved in creating that piece of content. So there might be a reporter, but there also might be an expert that gets interviewed in that article. Just having the name on the page, those are just words. That's fairly difficult for Google to take words on a page and figure out that a couple words in the middle of something is the name of somebody, and that's that same person, over here at this company that knows something about that, especially with more common names. Even a name like mine, relatively unusual, Michael Cottam. But if you Google my name, you'll find that there's some famous English cricket player named Michael Cottam, and there's some guy who even has the same middle initials as me, who's known just because he wrote a white paper on why buffalo wallow in tall grass. And and so Google has this problem, is like, especially with a relatively common name, is they can't just take the words and go, oh, Amy Rosenberg here, that's the same Amy that wrote this and the same Amy that published this over here. That's a very difficult problem, especially across the trillions times trillions of pages on the web. So
Okay.
what you've got to do is you've got to help Google along, help them be able to figure out that these two words are Amy Rosenberg, and that's the name of a person being quoted in this article, and that's the same person as this LinkedIn profile and this Facebook profile and this interview over here at the Oregonian and this interview over here at the Seattle Times, or whatever happens to be.
So then how do you actually do that within one piece? Do you link? So like I would link to if I'm writing a blog post with my name on it, I should link maybe to my web or my LinkedIn, and then maybe I should reference something else I had said in the Seattle Times within the article and then link to that. Is that how we do it? Or
that's difficult to do, especially in an article that you're getting some other publication to publish. They're not going to really want to do that, right? Because too many links at the end looks like, well, why are these here? Now, one link in the bio or two links in the bio can make some sense, and so that's a good thing to do if you can get that to happen. The best way to do it, if you can do it, is to use something called schema markup. And schema markup is hidden in a web page, and it's basically a bunch of data that tells Google what the web page is about and what are the various entities in the web page. So let's say it's an article and it's in the New York Times and it's written by Amy Rosenberg and it's about the travel industry, and it's got a video in there from Tahiti tourism, something like that. The schema markup is hidden and users can't see it, but Google can see it in the page. And the schema markup will tell Google this overall page is an article and it's published by this entity called the New York Times. And the New York Times, with these special links called same as links in it, in the markup, is this website over here, and this is the New York Times LinkedIn, and this is their Better Business Bureau page, et cetera, et cetera. So they can figure, okay, well, I understand who the organization is, and they're kind of spread across the web. And then within that article, there's going to be an element that says that the author of this article is Amy Rosenberg. And here's Amy's first name and last name, and then these same as links for the person say, this is Amy's LinkedIn, this is Amy's Veracity marketing website, this is Amy's Facebook, this is Amy's Twitter, et cetera, et cetera. And so with this schema markup that is kind of living behind the scenes, invisible to the user, Google can go, oh, I get what this page is all about. And I get that Amy is interviewing this person named Michael Cottam, who is this person over here on LinkedIn and this person on Facebook. So all this kind of structure is there. Google goes, oh, I get it. I get who the people are. I get what the article's about. I get the videos about Tahiti.
We're basically relying on the New York Times or whatever to use schema markup. Is that correct?
Yeah, and so the big publications are getting there in terms of getting this to happen. One of the things that's helped this along tremendously is the Yoast plugin for WordPress. So a huge percentage of the web's websites out there are on WordPress, and most everybody that knows anything about SEO will put the Yoast plugin in there to help manage a lot of this kind of structured data. Now, what Yoast has done in a relatively recent version of the plugin is they'll take the data from the WordPress user profile, and that's where you can put your LinkedIn and your Facebook and your bio page at About Us and et cetera, et cetera. They'll take all that data from your WordPress user profile and they'll make the schema markup for article with the author in it and all these bits and pieces automatically. Okay. And so this is starting to happen automatically as long as you're using real user profiles in WordPress.
Yeah. So, okay, I'm pretty serious about my press lists. I feel like press lists are the beginning of every campaign. And so even before you get the campaign. So how do we know if a website's using schema maybe I'm saying it wrong, schema markup. And then my tip to PRs when you want to do SEO PR is to have a website, to have your press list have a section talking about SEO where you add the DA, domain authority of the site. And you might have to go to a different tool to get that, because my media database does not have that. So then we have to go to Moz, and we always research and add little notes on what they do. Like they give links, they don't give links. So how do we add who does the schema markup into our list?
Okay. It's actually relatively easy. So take a recent article from that publication, take the URL of that article, and if you go to Google and search for structured data tester, you'll find Google's tool. And you basically paste that URL in the tool, and it'll show you whatever markup's on the page. And generally, you'll probably see markup for organization, markup for article, maybe markup for a person, and that sort of stuff. If you're not seeing any of that, let's say it's the New York Times and they're not doing that. I'm pretty sure they are. But let's say it's the New York Times and they're not doing the schema markup. Do you still want the article and the link? Well, yes, both because lots of people are actually going to read it, and also because the link alone is worth something. But ideally, if you had two different websites to run an article on, two different publications, you'd prefer the one that had all that link juice and brand recognition and was doing the markup, because having the markup there is going to help you with your EAT scores for your own site.
Okay. Guys, we will write this down in the blog post, so check it out if you don't want to take notes. If you're driving, don't stop. Okay, so now you bring up, okay, so now we're getting into the weeds. Sorry, guys, but this is just, I like to have answers and I like to just do it right? And then we can talk about more interesting things, I guess, to you, but I like getting in the weeds. Sorry, listeners. That could just talk about, the two disciplines working together. We could talk about that and how possibly the roles could be combined. Either I don't see that happening. But anyway, the question that's in the weeds is, so what if you have two sites that are like exactly the same? So the same DA, they're both using that schema markup. But one gives links and one doesn't. You want the one that gives the link, right?
Right.
Or what else how do you evaluate websites that are equal?
So presuming they're both giving a link, and in both cases it's a followed link. So a followed link is basically a link that does not have a tag on it that says rel equals nofollow or rel equals UGC, which stands for user-generated content. And these are hidden tags in the link in the page that tells Google to count the link towards PageRank or not count it. So an ad, for instance, would have a nofollow link because Google doesn't want to count that. A link posted in the comments on an article, because the publisher can't control who posted what there, that's going to be nofollowed. So you're going to look at the links within the article itself on past articles that website has published and see if they're following links to outside websites.
Okay.
You're looking for this nofollow tag on the link. And if it's not there, it's good.
We'll show you guys on a blog post. So, okay. So nofollow links, they don't do anything for you.
So they don't do anything for PageRank, and Google has said that for a long time. And I don't think that they're lying, but there's something important to recognize here. And it's a change that happened, I think it's about a year ago. Google all of a sudden came out with a recommendation for webmasters that for comments or for links in user-generated content on your site, instead of just using rel equals nofollow to say, hey, somebody posted this in a comment, I can't control it, can't vouch for it, they said, we want those links that users post, let's say it's a forum discussion or some sort of thread on some site. We'd like to see those links marked with rel equals UGC for user-generated content. And then you can mark your ads with rel equals sponsored. Now, why would Google care about links that they're not counting towards PageRank being ads versus user-generated content? The obvious thing there is that they care about links that are coming from user-generated content. And they care about links that are coming from social media, which are generally nofollowed, like links you share on Facebook or Twitter or whatever. Reddit, Quora, all that sort of stuff. Google is caring about those because those are an indication of what's hot right now, in that if something really is a hot topic, you're going to see it on Reddit, on Facebook, on Twitter, long before you start seeing a pile of links. So the long game for Google is, after something has been hot for 6 months, yeah, they should expect to see links to whatever that piece of content is that's so hot. But in the first day it's hot and gets out there, they're going to see a pile of social media links, links in forums, links in discussion groups, links in Quora, things like that would normally be no-followed. Those are user-generated content links. Those are indications that the real world out there is chattering about this piece of content and they're all excited about it. And that's a signal Google wants to take to say, hey, that must be important. We want if it really is popular in all these other places, then we want to show it in the search results because it's hot for whatever reason.
So then even if we post it ourselves, like a client on a client's page, that counts as being important. Like if we post a blog post that we create for a client on their LinkedIn page, does that help Google?
Yes. And so if something really is hot, Google's going to expect to see it getting mentions all over the place. Let's say you have something that you're pushing for a client and you want it to rank well and get a bunch of attention, and you put $1,000 behind it, boosting a post on Facebook, and that's all you do. Think about it from Google's perspective. If all of a sudden they see a ton of activity on Facebook about a particular page, thousands and thousands of people are resharing this for whatever reason, and there's nothing on Reddit, nothing on LinkedIn, nothing on Twitter, nothing in forums, that's very suspicious. They know you paid to boost it, right?
And so however, they will not count that then.
They're probably going to dampen the weighting that all that, whatever their numeric factor is they're using to feed into ranking. They're probably going to dampen that because they're not going to trust it. A normal pattern would be some sort of a bell curve where, let's say it's something that's very business related. You expect a lot more chatter on LinkedIn than Facebook, right? If it's something to do with fashion or some TV star, movie star, whatever, well, now you'd expect it to be on Instagram and Facebook, maybe Twitter, but not so much on LinkedIn. But there's still going to be a little bit, right? And maybe there's nothing on LinkedIn, but there's stuff on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and Pinterest. That would be kind of a normal kind of shape to the bell curve.
So let me ask you a question. So PRs, we're pretty focused on getting press. So instead, should we first, and I'm not saying instead, I'm not going to change our job description actually, but should we focus on getting social attention first and then move to getting outside links from PR?
I think it's a mix. So if you follow along your traditional path of you get some real press for the client, whether you got the link or not, then it's worth spending a little bit of money to take that article that you got and share it on your Facebook page, like, hey, the client's Facebook page, and say, hey, we were mentioned in the Portland Oregonian, and then boost that with some money on Facebook to get a bunch of other people to see it, and some other people will share or comment on it. So now Google will say, okay, I see a link from the Oregonian. That's good. There must be something important going on. And I'm seeing chatter on Facebook, and you share it on Twitter. And I see some retweets and links from various tweets on Twitter. And maybe the picture that was used in the article, maybe that got posted to Pinterest. Now Google's going to see this scattering of social media buzz as well as the link from the newspaper itself. That's the right kind of pattern. If you're Googling and you want to know, is something really hot, then you should expect to see that. The press is writing about it, people are talking about it, and the various little social media areas. That's a legitimate footprint of something that is interesting to whatever that audience is.
So when we're writing, as PR people, we are writing, how important is it to sneak keywords? And real PR people would never stuff any document with keywords. We would tend towards being the opposite and just not do enough of thinking about keywords. So do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. So these days, what Google appears to be doing, and there's lots of different terms for this and theories, but in general, what they appear to be doing to decide if a given page is a really good page about whatever that topic is they appear to be looking at the relatively unusual terms that are in that piece of content and comparing it to other pages, they'd rank really well for that same term or topic, and see what relatively unusual words are in those other pages. And so let's say they look at the top 20 pages they'd rank for the term, Tahiti weather. If they find out of the top 20 pages, they find that 17 talk about humidity, then Google doesn't even need to know what humidity means and that it's related to the word weather. What they see is that 17 out of 20 pages that are otherwise pretty good pages about Tahiti weather talk about humidity. And yet your average recipe page or news page or e-commerce page doesn't talk about humidity. So that must be a related term. And so Google can go through these pages and say, okay, this is the corpus of 70 different terms that make up this topic. Now, how many of those 70 terms does your piece of content have? If the answer is you have 20 out of the 70, it's probably related to that topic, or it's trying to be about that topic, but it's not very thorough. If, on the other hand, you have 57 of the 70 terms that seem to be the core things that any perfect article about Tahiti weather should talk about, if you have 57 out of 70, that's probably an A+. Nobody's going to have 70, right? Because different use of synonyms or whatever. And so that's the sort of thing to pay attention to. If you're trying to get a piece of content ranked well for a client, is look at what the other pages out there on the web that are currently ranking for whatever that topic is, look at what they're talking about.
Okay. So if people are wondering why I'm talking about this, is we do a lot of writing that ends up being on the client's website or in the press, because we do ghostwritten articles that are contributed pieces for the press. That's just what we do. So most of our work is writing. And so that is literally going to affect SEO. Okay. Mm-hmm. Because I think people might have heard my new term is the blog post has replaced the press release as the new press release. I mean, why would I just write a press release and just put it in a file and it's not, it needs to live somewhere, you know? So now you're saying a lot about having keywords in a lot of the same keyword possibly in one document. And as a real writer, which a lot of PR people are, we would just rip that up. I can't have repeated words in one document. Are you saying that is just the wrong approach?
Yeah. So repetition of a keyword is not going to help you in Google search anymore. I mean, it did 10 years ago, but if you're trying to rank for blue widgets, having the phrase blue widgets on the page 25 times is probably going to hurt your ranking, because Google's going to pick that up and go, this looks really spammy. That's very unnatural. Instead, what you want is, if Google decides that most pages that talk about blue widgets also talk about plugins and add-ons and Chrome extensions and user experience and functionality, if those are words that Google's seeing in other pages, then your page ought to have those other words as well. And honestly, once is enough. So with my Visual Itineraries travel site, about 6 or 7 years ago, I had a page that I tuned for best time of year to visit Tahiti. And it's still tuned for that because that's what converts to leads for me. But all of a sudden, I started getting traffic for the phrase Tahiti weather. I was ranking on page 1 for Tahiti weather, which is a pretty competitive term. That page did not have the word weather in it anywhere. Not the page title, not in the text, not in alt text in the images. The word weather wasn't mentioned. But what Google could do is Google could look at that page and look at the footprint of the other relatively new words and go, gee, I see storms, cyclones, humidity, precipitation, scuba diving, visibility, temperature, Celsius, Fahrenheit, inches of rainfall, and look at that and go, I know this page is about Tahiti weather. And so that's actually what happened. So whereas it used to be, if you wanted to rank for Tahiti weather, your page title would start with Tahiti weather, your H1 would have Tahiti weather, you'd have the phrase Tahiti weather in the page 10 or 15 times, and there you go. This is flipped on its head so far that on a super competitive term like Tahiti weather, my site with 1/1000th of the backlinks of weather.com and Wonderground and Tahiti Tourism and the other sites are ranked there. So I had a tiny fraction of the backlinks, so links wasn't it. Didn't even have that one word weather anywhere in the page, and yet I could rank on page 1. And so that's how far we've come from, repeating a keyword to rank to you might not even need the keyword.
Oh, now, good.
Yeah.
because I don't like to write in a structured way.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So yeah, now to kind of the bigger topics. Just, talking about the two disciplines, search and PR, and, how they can work together and how the two disciplines could be combined.
Okay. So the key thing. So there's a famous Canadian hockey player named Wayne Gretzky, and
Oh, yeah.
Wayne is a famous saying. He says, I don't skate to where the puck is. I skate to where the puck is going. And that's what we've got to do with Google. While Google is still working on trying to, detect things like, what's the author's footprint around the web? Is this person really the same as that person? Is this a legit link or a bad link? The reality is what Google's trying to measure is this topic or brand or product, whatever it is, actually popular? Is it hot? Is this article that's a resource on something? Is it really the best article about the best time to go to TD, whatever happens to be? That's where they're going, is trying to figure that out. So SEOs that are thinking about, it's all about links, I got to build more links, or PR people who are thinking about, I got to get articles that have links. If that's where you're focused to where the puck is. You're not focused where the puck is going. So PR has been since before the internet a way to get brand awareness and get people to learn about your company or your product or your people or your expertise, whatever happens to be. And that's the long game. In terms of SEO, Google will eventually get to where it doesn't really need the link to know that you are popular and being talked about everywhere, and you've covered this topic thoroughly, or you have the most features, or whatever happens to be. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and it helps our job a lot because honestly, a lot of our SEO PR clients, which are the ones that just hire us for SEO purposes, that you thankfully, a lot of them are your clients. Now I don't want to offend your clients, but some of them can be a little impatient, meaning they want it and they want it now and they want the link. And so it's good to hear this because, PR is so uncontrollable. And I guess searches as well. No longer can we buy links, and you can't even buy a press release link. And if you do, that used to actually punish you on PR Newswire. Now it just doesn't count for anything. So that's helpful. And a lot of PR people might be thanking you right now. So then how can PR people and search people more effectively work together?
Okay. So here's the thing. You can be doing the right thing in terms of getting brand awareness and getting people to recognize the product or the company or the expertise, whatever it is, getting the press out there. The SEO's job in this partnership is basically to make sure that when you do get that piece of that press mention or article published or whatever it is, that under the covers you've done everything you can to make it as easy as possible for Google to figure out the stuff they want to figure out about it, to recognize who the author is, to recognize it's about a product that's called Michael's Blue Widget or whatever it happens to be, to see what the price is and what the weight and the 10 reviews and what the average review, all that sort of structural stuff. Because if you're not doing the SEO stuff, you're basically making Google go into a blind with their arms tied behind their back to try to figure out what the content is and is it quality, is it worthwhile, is it written by somebody credible. So the SEO's job is to do as much as you can of the mechanics to kind of serve it up to Google on a platter so Google can easily see all these pieces that they're desperately trying to measure.
So then should the SEOs really figure out who the PR's thought leaders are going to be and focus on somehow distinguishing the author's names, or, what you were talking about in the beginning?
I think so. So let me just throw an example out that might make this clear. Let's say you want to get an article out there about traveling doing road trips in your RV with pets, for instance. I know you did a story for one of my clients on that. If the article is written by a person who Google can tie to being a columnist at some pet magazine, and also in the article you have an interview with somebody who's an expert in RVs and reviews of RVs and renting RVs, whatever happens to be, and you've got another person in the article who's Rick Steves or somebody like that, who's notable in the travel space. If you can show Google all this, think about how this looks to Google. It's like, here's an article about traveling and RVs and pets, and we can see that the people who contribute to the article are the expert in travel and the expert in pets and the expert in RVs. That's pretty solid.
Okay, so maybe it's better for us not to, well, now I'm taking us away from the SEO's job, but for the PR, it's better for us not to work on getting authors published. Maybe we just want to go back to old school style, which is getting articles about our people and clients.
Well, and it can be both. The key is, what you want to do is, if you want the article to rank well, you want to show Google there's a lot of expertise that went into this article. You want to make it really easy for them to see that, these are the various experts involved in this. And if that means you do ghostwriting for the client or for the other expert, or you kind of spoon feed the other expert a quote and get them to agree to say they said that, that's great. You can put words in their mouth as presuming you have their permission, etc. But
I see. So we really, again, as PR people, are acting like the reporter. So we could go out and get external quotes in our pieces and, of course, get them approved and then put them in the thing. Yeah, I was going to say release, but the whatever you're writing. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and going back to that, think about it from the user's perspective. If there's an article about how to pick the best RV, or how to buy a used RV, and the article is written by Michael Cottam, I don't have any expertise in choosing RVs, right? As the consumer, you're like, why should I believe this? What makes this valuable? If, on the other hand, the article is by, Joe Smith, and Joe was a designer of marathon motorhomes for 20 years or something like this, as a consumer, you're like, Joe knows something about this. In fact, Joe knows a lot about this. Whatever he has to say in this article is probably pretty accurate and insightful compared to what Michael Cottam would have written, right? Because he has it. So from the consumer's perspective, that's a way better article because I know Joe wrote it. Now, maybe I wrote it and I asked Joe some questions to fill the stuff in. If the article is attributed to Joe, from the consumer's perspective, it's, however much he wrote doesn't really matter. It's he clearly had lots of input into this, and some of this is his opinion. That's really strong, and Google's going to look at it the exact same way.
So then, so basically Google is acting like the consumer or the decision maker.
Right. They're trying to replicate that. They're trying to behave just like the consumer would in terms of, should I trust this article about RVs? If Joe wrote the article and he really is that expert, but you don't tell the reader that Joe has been designing RVs for 20 years for one of the biggest motorhome companies, then you don't get any creds with the reader, right? If, on the other hand, the intro bio says, here's Joe's expertise, and now here's Joe's top 10 tips. Now with the reader, it's like, okay, I know why I should believe what Joe has to say. And Google's going to mirror that. They want to mimic that.
How can I boost my people, like my thought leaders, their author profiles? Because we do like to, I don't know if that a lot of us have time to go out and get external sources and this and that. And we do like to control the documents. And so when we get articles placed, we have a lot of control over the messaging. So how can I just boost my people in the SEO to be credible?
I think separate from the article that you'd be focused on right then, you should be working to get those people referenced in other articles that are in generally related fields so that Google starts to see this expertise. So, for instance, the reason I rank on page 1 or page 2 for SEO consultant everywhere in the world is not because I've been blogging about SEO on my own site. I think I blogged twice last year. So
Lucky you.
it's not blogging on my own site that's doing it. However, I did a Whiteboard Friday for Moz, or maybe it was a main blog post. I did a negative SEO podcast for Stan Ventures. I forget who else I did blog posts for. But so I did guest posts on other SEO sites, which then link back to me. And so now Google can start to paint this picture of, oh, Michael's talking about SEO on some other big trusted sites. He might actually know what he's talking about here, right? And so
Okay.
that
So that's
in
the whole
any
thing.
industry.
Yeah, that's what we do. It's just a lot of times I'm a little bit more focused on the client, like the name, not the client, but the name of the company versus the author. So we can kind of switch gears and do both, I guess.
Right.
So how do you see the two disciplines evolving, in their combination? Could they ever be combined one day? And what are your thoughts on all that?
Well, I think the tools are getting good enough that you don't have to be like a technical web developer to be able to look at Schema and decide if it's showing who the author is and where the authors' other profiles are. Because the Schema, there's plenty of tools out there that'll basically look at a web page and do all the technical stuff to extract the Schema into a human readable form where you can go, oh, okay, I see what Google sees. So the tools are bringing it to where the PR person doesn't need the SEO person so much to tell them whether it worked or didn't work.
Okay.
You still can always run into the problem of you're unlikely to talk the publisher into changing what they do for structurally publishing articles to include something that's new. Eventually, the big publications are going to have SEO teams that have been all over this for 5 years, right? But the little small town newspaper might not be there yet, and you're not going to talk them into adding the Schema. What you can do as a PR person with these tools is you can measure whether these publishers that you're thinking of pitching are doing the right things or not, whether they're using Schema, whether they're following links, all that sort of stuff. And you can use that as a decision-making tool to go after newspaper A versus newspaper B, magazine A versus magazine B.
Yeah. So it all comes down to the press list. Mm-hmm. So, okay. So I'm going to take just a quick dive back into the weeds because another question just came up in my mind as you were talking earlier. What should we do after the press coverage hits? Because from a search perspective, is there anything that we should think about as PR people?
Absolutely. Hammer social media with it. If you get a press mention, you want that shared all over the place on social media. You want as much exposure as possible, partly for the search side. So if Google sees, hey, here's a press mention and a link, that's good for the PageRank stuff. And boy, over here, that exact same page on that website is getting all this chatter on Facebook and Twitter and LinkedIn. That's the right signal to be sending to Google. And the other thing is from the pure human user point of view is the percentage of people that might see a news story at a given magazine or a newspaper versus the ones who will see that news story and read it by seeing it first in Facebook and then clicking on it. The latter is where people get their news today, as evidenced by this last year's worth of election stuff. People don't mostly go to the news sites to find the articles. They get waylaid by the article showing up in their Facebook timeline, and they click it there, and that's how they land on the New York Times or whatever happens to be.
Yeah.
And so when you get that press mention, don't count on everybody having gone to that newspaper or magazine and read it. You want to fire hose that over the social media channels that your clients' customers follow. If it's a B2B thing, well, then you want it all over LinkedIn. If it's a fashion industry, real estate, travel, Instagram, Pinterest, and Facebook.
So then should we not put advertising behind any of that social fire hose because it's bad for Google or?
Good question. So here's the thing. When you look at something like Facebook, it's important to understand the difference between a news feed and a timeline. The news feed is what Facebook chooses to show you from your friends' timelines and from ads, based on who they think you are, from your profile, what you've clicked on in the past, all that sort of stuff. So that's your news feed. Google can never see a news feed. Google is not a logged in Facebook user. I'm sure they have plenty of test accounts where they're messing with things, but Google's not looking at all of Facebook as a logged in user like we are. What Google can see, however, and this is pretty important, is Google can see anybody's public timeline where they haven't hidden it from people by making it private to just their friends. So any business's timeline, for instance, is visible. Most people's Facebook personal timelines are public as well, and Google can see those. So let's say you want to get Google to see that there's a lot of action going on about this new article that was posted on the client site. You share that article on Facebook with a link back to that article on the site. You then put a bunch of money behind it, boosting that post on Facebook to people you think might comment or reshare it. Now, Google's going to see that one instance of that link from your client's company Facebook page timeline, because that's visible. Google's not going to see the 10,000 ad impressions that you got for that ad you boosted. But Google will see is the 120 times people who saw the 10,000 ads thought that's interesting. That lines with my worldview. I think this is funny, or whatever happens to be, and reshared it to their own timeline. That's where you get that buzz.
Okay, so for us, we do a lot of mostly B2B. So then it would be probably the employees that would share it. So then we would be somehow figuring out how to get advertised to the employees.
Yeah, and maybe it's LinkedIn for a B2B, right?
Yeah.
If you can get a bunch of people to reshare an article that they saw on LinkedIn, great.
Well, wonderful. Well, thank you for this. This was very helpful.
You're very welcome.
Is there anything that we didn't talk about that you think PR people definitely need to know?
I think we've done a pretty deep and broad dive in this today already.
Okay, good. Well, I appreciate it. I'm sure everybody else does too.
Sure thing.
Thanks for listening to the PR Talk podcast. Find Amy's book, A Modern Guide to Public Relations, plus more PR Talk episodes at prtalk.co. And remember to subscribe, rate, and review.